The rumor mill was turning for the New York Mets on Tuesday, and of all the things that we learned, the most exciting one is the fact that they are in on top relief arm Tanner Scott. What could he bring to the table in 2025? I'll discuss that and more on today's show.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Now, of everything we learned on Tuesday, the report that jumped out the most came from Will Salmon of The Athletic. He reported that the New York Mets are in on Tanner Scott. Here's what he says, written in The Athletic directly. He says, quote, "The New York Mets' pursuit of bullpen reinforcements differs somewhat from how they navigated the starting pitching market. With relievers, they're exploring the most expensive options available and have met, likely via phone or video, with the top remaining free agent option, Tanner Scott," these sources said. Now, this is really interesting because the Mets, when it came to navigating the starting pitching market, they obviously did not shoot for the top arms. They were not interested in going to, big long-term deals with Corbin Burns, Blake Snell, or Max Fried. Instead, they brought their own guy back in Sean Manaea. That was their top starting pitcher they added. He was clearly in that tier 2 of free agent pitchers. They took some gambles. They bet on Frankie Montas to bounce back. They are hoping Clay Holmes can convert from a reliever to a starting pitcher. If you look at the Mets rotation right now, I have my concerns. I think they have the depth to get through the season, but come October, I think something has to give for this rotation. Either Sean Manaea is the exact guy he was last year, if not better. Kodai Senga is healthy and looks like the guy from 2023, and one of Clay Holmes or Frankie Montas has an unbelievable season where you have 3 arms you can trust, or I guess David Peterson I should throw into that mix as well. I think he has the ability to take the ball in October. Or Brandon Sproat, their top pitching prospect, debuted and was awesome and was actually still available come October, or the Mets made a trade at the deadline. I think that's where we're at the rotation. But what would help is getting a bullpen that can be really dominant, that can shorten games, that will lock down all of those close games and give Edwin Diaz some help. So this interest in the top of the market is really exciting. Now, I want to read a little bit more from Will Salmon's reporting. He says, "To be clear, it doesn't mean the Mets will end up signing Scott or anyone else from that tier. The expectation is for the team to check out all segments of the relief market, including trades. But even for a club like the Mets, which checks in on many different players, it's notable that they'd hold at least some interest in the best option available." He continues to say the Mets are looking to add 1 to 2 relievers to the bullpen. It was reported, actually, that was the end of his report. This was another one. It was reported, I think it was Sean McAdam, said that Tanner Scott wants $80 million. Jeff Passan reported that the expectation in the industry is that Tanner Scott would sign a 4-year, $60 million deal, which just happens to be exactly what I predicted for us over at Just Baseball. What does all this mean when it comes to Tanner Scott? What would he bring to the table? He would give you a real secondary closing option because he was a closer for the Marlins last year, and he did get, I think, a couple saves with the Padres as well if they got traded there at the deadline. Overall, he saved 22 games on 24 attempts. He's coming off a season where he pitched to a 1.75 ERA, and here's the big thing too, a workhorse, 72 innings pitched out of the pen. That's not nothing. So you look at Tanner Scott and what he would mean to the Mets bullpen. He would give you a lights-out left-handed reliever that throws absolute fuzz. Averaged 97 miles per hour on his fastball last year. He can just bully lefties up in the zone. It's just dominance from Tanner Scott. Has a nasty slider he pairs with it, so it's your typical fastball slider mix. You got one of those guys in Edwin Diaz, and here's another one, but you have a lefty-righty combination. You love that at the end of your bullpen, and you'd have the ability to really have a ton of flexibility where 7th inning of the game, you got Bryce Harper coming up. Here comes Tanner Scott to get him out in a big spot. Maybe it's a team that has a big right-handed hitter. I'm trying to think of one Let's just say you're playing the Blue Jays. I don't know why they came to my mind. But you got Vladdy coming up in the 8th inning or the 7th inning. Maybe go to Edwin Diaz because you still have Tanner Scott that can close out games. Having both of these guys would just be ridiculous for the New York Mets. I'm still expecting that Edwin Diaz has a bounce back. If you look at his stuff last year, it didn't really tail off. The execution did, but he was coming off a year of not pitching at all due to that knee injury. And so I think the rust got in the way. And then there were some mental hurdles I think he had to go through. But we saw him get big outs in October when it mattered the most. He did have some struggles there as well. But I think Edwin Diaz can get back to being the guy he was, if not in 2022, because that's a ridiculously high bar. Something a little bit less than that, 80% of that, 90% of that. And if Tanner Scott is even 90% of what he was last year, and you have those two guys, you are going to be really set at the end of games. Tanner Scott is 30 years old. If he has, or if he gets a 4-year contract, I don't think you're too worried about that. I think he can pitch really well for the next 4 years. It's also worth noting Edwin Diaz has an opt-out after 2025. So if he has a great season, he could hit the market. If the Mets are paying Tanner Scott a significant amount of money, they could make the decision, you know what? Tanner Scott's going to be our closer. Thank you for the memories, Edwin. And we won't hear any more trumpets playing at Citi Field. Now, I think with where Edwin Diaz is at in his career, with what he might get in the market, considering the fact that he still has 2 years remaining after that opt-out and a club option, he might be best served just to opt in. But again, if he has a remarkable season, he might opt out to try to get one last big deal, and you would have some coverage there. Now, there's a lot of teams in on Tanner Scott. The Dodgers might be in on Tanner Scott. The Braves reportedly in on Tanner Scott. You never know, the Phillies could get in on Tanner Scott. This is a top relief arm that really could impact the National League. Depending on where he goes, he could have a huge impact come October. So getting him, it might turn into a little bit of a bidding war. But as long as it doesn't get to 4 years, $80 million, I think you're okay. And even if it does get to 4 years, $80 million, if there's deferred money in that deal, similar to what the Mets signed with Edwin Diaz, where he got, what was it, 102 million, but the deferred money made the present day value. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but it was definitely a lot close. It was under $20 million per season at that point, the luxury tax hit. If you can get that down so you're not paying as much on the tax, and if you can work with Tanner Scott a little bit to get a deal that is slightly more favorable than $20 million per season straight up, I think it's a no-brainer. And honestly, it's not my money. So if the Mets signed him to a 4-year, $80 million contract tomorrow, I would not be clutching my pearls saying, oh, I can't believe the Mets did this. I can't believe they're going to pay this guy. You know what? It is what it is. If Steve Cohen wants to go to that level, if David Stearns wants to spend in that way for this pitcher, I would be fired up, and you should too, because what you would have is the best 1-2 punch the Mets have had in their bullpen in some time. One of the better 1-2 punches in baseball. Very similar to what David Stearns once had in with the Brewers, where he had Josh Hader and Devin Williams for a couple of years. Now, the difference is those guys were pre-arbitration for a period, then Hader got to arbitration, but they were not making a lot of money. Meanwhile, you're talking about two of the most expensive relievers in baseball, likely between Tanner Scott and Edwin Diaz. But again, it's Steve Cohen's Mets, and there is not a relief pitcher available that could impact the Mets more than Scott. And really at this point, I don't know if there is outside of the top of the position player market with Pete Alonso, Alex Bregman, Anthony Santander. I don't know if there is another free agent in general that can impact the Mets more than Tanner Scott. The one exception being Roki Sasaki, and we're going to talk about him in the next segment. But I just think this is an absolute win if the Mets can pull this off. And if they do, I really don't even care who the second arm is. Now, I'm greedy. I love to see the Mets sign Tanner Scott and David Robertson. But if they spent the money that they would have to get Scott, I'd imagine that would be the real big ticket addition. And then you would see if you could get maybe Ryan Stanek back for a similar $4 million contract that he signed last year. If you can pull that off, I think it's great. You would just sort of wait out the market and try to maybe nab one more arm. But as far as I'm concerned, the Mets signed Tanner Scott and they did nothing else to address their pitching. and Davis Stearns just got a bunch of minor league deals and said they were going to figure it out, I'd feel so good because the Mets have the depth that they need in the starting rotation as far as just surviving the season. We'll talk about if they need to add an ace at the deadline or if they still should be in the market in the next segment for another arm. But when it comes to their bullpen, if they can roll out a pen that's got Edwin Diaz, Tanner Scott, and then some combination of Reed Garrett and Daniel Nunez and Jose Budo, I think you'd have one of the better bullpens in baseball. And that is something that you can go to war with and hopefully really contend in the National League. The next segment, though, could they add Roki Sasaki? It's not looking as likely. I want to explain the latest reporting there in just a minute. First, though, quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Rocket Money. Does Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened for me. Not that I was paying for a subscription twice, but there were some subscriptions that I completely forgot about. And man, is that frustrating when you find out just how long you've been paying for them. But Rocket Money will make it easier for you to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances, and they will help you clear those up. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users who have saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. Cancel your unwanted subscription and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. Stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports when you check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Our next goal is to get to 12,000 subscribers. Getting pretty close. I appreciate all of you. Continue to subscribe. All right, so now let's talk about Roki Sasaki. Danny Martino talked about this on SNY tonight, and he said, quote, "I'm not hearing a lot of optimism in the industry that the Mets will be the team for Roki Sasaki." He says, "It seems as if what we see now in the rotation depth chart is going to be what they are rolling into the season with." So that's obviously really frustrating or disappointing. I would call it frustrating. I'd say disappointing because Roki Sasaki is a game changer. It does feel at this point like all roads are leading to the Dodgers, which makes no sense to me. I get the connection with Shohei Ohtani and Yoshinobu Yamamoto. The Dodgers have become Japan's team, and maybe there is more money to be had off the field by being part of that team, a member of the Los Angeles Dodgers. I don't know how all of that works when it comes to the money that these guys bring in and endorsements overseas or in their home country. I just don't know. So maybe that really is what it comes down to, that Roki Sasaki will make significantly more money playing for the Dodgers than any other team. And he also might see them as the place to go as far as developing him as a pitcher because the Dodgers are good at that. But if he cares about winning, actually, it's a great place to go too. But if he cares about winning, oh geez, I'm leaving that in there. No, obviously, it's a great situation to win, and it's a great situation to get paid, and it's even a good situation to develop. But the Dodgers haven't been very good at keeping their pitchers healthy. That's one thing, and they have so many pitchers. And maybe the idea is, look, they're going to churn and burn anyway, and a couple of those guys are going to be out of the rotation, and you go into spring training with a depth chart of 7. One of those guys is destined to not be available, and that's just going to keep happening throughout the season. I'm sure that's how they see it, and maybe that's how Roki Sasaki sees it. But he has a chance, and I'm not even just saying with the Mets. Go sign with the Padres. I'd be more happy because you know what? Even though the Padres are another team competing with the Mets, and that would help them, I just don't like seeing all the top guys go to one team. And for Roki Sasaki, if he wants to be special, if he wants to be Rookie of the Year, if he wants to win Cy Youngs, if he wants to be the face of a rotation, that's not happening when you have two guys who are more established, who have bigger names in your country in Ohtani and Yamamoto ahead of you on the depth chart in that starting rotation. Just not going to happen. Go pitch with Yu Darvish. Go to the Padres. I would be more happy about that. But it does appear, according to Andy Martino's reporting, that they are not going to be the team to land Sasaki. They're always a bit of a long shot. I was holding out hope that the fact that Wasserman, his agency, clearly values the Mets' ability to develop pitching. You have Clay Holmes, Wasserman client, who they chose the Mets as a destination for him to make that transition to be a starting pitcher. You also have Griffin Canning, represented by Wasserman, where they had, I'm sure, other teams that he could have gone to, gotten the chance to start and be in a rotation potentially from opening day on. And they chose the Mets as the place to go because I guess they imagine that the Mets can get more out of Griffin Canning than other teams would. So I thought that side of it was a big boost when it came to landing Sasaki, that his agency values the Mets' ability to develop pitching. I thought the fact that it was a winning situation would be nice, big market. He would have a mentor in Kodai Senga. I thought there was a chance, but now it's seeming like that won't happen. So if Martino's reporting is accurate, they're good at their rotation. And we've been talking about that on this show for weeks now, ever since they signed Sean Manaea, even before that, where it was sort of feels like they might sign Sean Manaea. And if they do, or if they trade for Luis Castillo, they're going to add one more arm. That's it. Now it seems like this is exactly what we all expected. They are pretty locked in. It's going to be Manaea, Senga, Holmes, Montas, Peterson. That's your 1 through 5. You have an open competition between Paul Blackburn, Griffin Canning, Tyler McGill, and even to some extent Jose Budo to get that last spot. If they are going to roll with a 6-man rotation, I think they will primarily. There's enough off days in the schedule where they can get, Senga on 5 days rest on that 6-day schedule, where you might not always need to have that 6th starter in the rotation. You can have them as more swingmen if it is Blackburn and Canning coming in the rotation, pitching length out of the bullpen. I think there's a lot of ways the Mets can make this work, and I do believe they have enough depth. But there is still that question about having the top of the rotation arm. And Roki Sasaki would have been one of those guys that come October, if he was healthy, you would have felt pretty good about the idea of him getting the ball in a playoff game. Now, there's some doubts there. And you look at the market, the Mets aren't reportedly in, but let's just say they were. Who else would you sign at this point? Justin Verlander just signed a 1-year, $15 million deal with the Giants. I imagine Max Scherzer is going to get a similar contract with some team. Is it the Mets? Probably not. Nick Pivetta, well, you got to give up a qualifying offer. You have to give up, the comp picks because he received the qualifying offer to get Pivetta. Don't think they're going to do that. Jack Flaherty looking for a 5-year deal. The Mets were staying away from long-term deals, so I don't think they're going to turn around to give Flaherty 5 years. So there's really nothing left for them in the free agent market unless they want to reunite with Jose Quintana, and even then that seems unlikely because of the depth they already have. Now in the trade market, you have Dylan Cease reportedly out there, but are the Padres going to send him to an NL rival? I don't know. I think it's a lot better than sending him to an NL West rival, but the Padres are still trying to compete. I think they might try to send him to an American League team. Particularly the Baltimore Orioles make a lot of sense as a Dylan Cease landing spot. They have the prospects to get the deal done, and the position player prospects the Padres might covet. Heston Kjerstad for Dylan Cease. It's a lot to give up if you're the Orioles because he has a chance to be a really good outfielder for a long time. But maybe they pull the trigger on that, or maybe they can find some other trade that works. I feel like if Cease gets dealt, there's a better chance that it's to an American League team. Pablo Lopez could be on the market because the Twins need to shed money. Is he better than Luis Castillo? Probably not, but he is maybe in that same conversation. I would like Pablo Lopez on the Mets, but based on what they've done already, I just don't foresee them doing that. Ultimately, I think where the Mets stand right now, Andy Martinez will get to in the next segment. He talked about how David Stearns does not view the roster as one that has to be all set come opening day. It's a living document, as Martino says, in which case you can add at various points in the season. And I think the Mets at this juncture are looking at their rotation and they want to see what they have in Senga and Manaea at the top, to start off the year. They want to see what they get from Montas and Holmes and Peterson and potentially even a Canning or a Blackburn. They want to watch Brandon Sproat develop in AAA, and maybe he's an answer at some point. All of these things they can learn in the first couple months of the year, where they have the depth if they do sustain an injury or two to make it by, especially if they add to that bullpen. Then you get to the trade deadline and you pick the frontline starter who's throwing the ball the best at that point. You also learn about those arms. One guy that stands out to me, and he's the one that I'd be willing to trade a lot of the top prospects for, I'd be all in on, is Sandy Alcantara. Now, the Marlins are going to sort of bet on him right now, where they're going to let him roll into the season and see if he can pitch like he did in 2023. Or excuse me, was it 2023? 2022, when he won the Cy Young. And even when he had a down year in 2023, his ERA was over 4, he still was at about 185 innings at the beginning of September when he goes down needing Tommy John surgery. He missed all of last year. He is building himself up. He seems to be ready to go to have a completely healthy spring training. And if Sandy is back to being himself, that's the guy I want to top the Mets rotation, especially because he has 2 more years of control after this season, I believe, and cheap team control. So you can either ride out that contract. I mean, relatively cheap team control. He's still making, let me think, I think the final year of the deal, he might get over 20, but relative to the market where, Corbin Burns is making $35 million per season, and Max Fried and Blake Snell got huge deals as well. I think it is a really good contract. Looking at it now, $17.3 million in 2025, $17.3 million in 2026, then a club option for $21 million in 2027, plus a trade assignment bonus of $1 million. The 2027 option has a $2 million buyout. So, yeah, I mean, quick math, what is that? 34.6, 55 and change $million for 3 years of Sandy Alcantara. That's a steal. That really is. So that's the guy I'm looking at, but that's the deadline. I don't think that's happening right now. So it seems like the Mets are very comfortable where they're at. If they do, in fact, miss on Sasaki, they're done with their rotation, and hopefully they just add an impact arm or two to round out that bullpen. But, of course, it's not an episode of Locked On Mets these days if we don't talk about Pete Alonso. I know we got a lot of fatigue there, but this was a report by Andy Martino about the alternatives that the Mets have if they choose to not sign Pete. And I thought that the reporting was very interesting. So I want to cover that to close out the show. First, though, another quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. Game Time Picks is their feature that'll help you filter out the fluff and shows you only the best possible deals on great seats. So you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. When you download the Game Time app, you can view your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. You can buy tickets in a matter of seconds. So download that Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. If you're an everyday listener to the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets Insider. This is our texting service. We get updates from me anytime news breaks on the match. You can ask me questions anytime. You can tell me if you're sick of me talking about Pete Alonso. I had an insider or two do that today. It was good to have a conversation with them about why I continue to do shows on it, because this is the biggest story surrounding the New York Mets. But again, Subtext is where you can go to be a Locked On Mets Insider and communicate with me about the show and get all that inside access. So if you want to be an insider, find the link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. All right, so Andy Martino had a story that came out today breaking down the alternatives if the Mets don't sign Pete Alonso. And the reason why I found this interesting is because this information comes from league sources, but likely is fed from somebody in the Mets front office trying to get a story out there. And this accomplishes a couple things. For one, you sort of gauge fan interest. You see how tired the fans are with the Pete Alonso sweepstakes. Would they be fine if the Mets just stayed internal? Like that's part of this. And then it's also, and the amount of information here, I'm guessing it's not all from a Mets source. I'm sure it could come from some agents and some different sources around the league, some other teams that have had communication with the Mets that can sort of pinpoint where they're targeting the market right now or what parts of the market they're targeting. So I think this information is very credible, and it does lay out what the Mets would potentially be left with if Pete Alonso felt scorned, if another team stormed into the mix, and he does sign with another team. So here's what he says. First option is an infield youth movement. Here's right from the story from SNY. Martino says, this seems like the most probable scenario if Alonso departs. A spring training without Alonso, which I got to stop there. A spring training without Alonso does not mean that Alonso is signed with another team. This could, in some way, be a little tiny tidbit that sort of shows where the Mets stand on this. So they're not moving off their position. The contract that they have on the table, that's where they are at right now. And they're comfortable going into spring training and seeing what they have internally, which, as Martino says, would see Mark Vientos, Brett Baty, Luis Acuna, and Ronnie Mauricio, and others all getting reps at third base, and most of those players seeing time at first base too. He says it would not necessarily mean declaring a full-time third and first baseman at the beginning or end of camp, but leaning into the versatility this season. He says in this scenario, the Mets could supplement the current group with a veteran utility infielder. Think a Jose Iglesias type, if not necessarily Iglesias himself. So, could I see that happening? Yes, I could see the Mets looking at this market, not really liking any of the free agents that are left, having waited out the Alonso thing, and maybe Scott Boras takes Alonso into spring training, which would suck for him. But let's just say it's the end of February and he's still unsigned. I could see the Mets bringing back Jose Iglesias on a modest one-year deal. He could be your third baseman. Mark Vientos could be your first baseman if nothing else breaks right with your young players. And if things do break right and Brett Baty, Mauricio, or Acuna, if one of those three guys wins a job, they win a job and they get the first crack at it. And you do roll into the season with that, you would be a better defensive team likely because I would say Baty and Acuna would play third base better than Vientos. Vientos playing first base at a level close to Pete is a possible outcome there. So your defense would be a little bit better. Your offense would be significantly worse. Sure, Ronnie Mauricio could play third base as well, but he hasn't done a ton of it. And I also think he needs to start the year in Syracuse. I think he's got to play every single day. But we'll talk about that more once we get to spring training. The bottom line here, if that is the most probable scenario, to me, it still doesn't feel like the outcome we're going to get. I just can't actually see opening day, Brett Baty runs out to third and Mark Vientos runs out to first. I just can't see it. Maybe it happens. I'm not betting on it. Now, he also talks about another option. Actually, here's also, I should mention, because I mentioned the living document thing. Here's where Martino says, he says, President of Baseball Operations David Stern has a track record of adding to and tweaking teams during the season. The opening day infield, and for that matter, the opening day offense is not an overly significant marker for the Mets who see the roster as a living document. Okay, sure. Next option that he breaks down, add an infield or DH bat. He says Jesse Winker is a possibility to return. Jurickson Profar could fit by playing some outfield and some first base. Profar was a shortstop at one point in time. I'm sure he can handle first base if they did sign him. Then he says Anthony Santander, who has reportedly received a contract offer from Toronto, is less likely for New York. If the Mets don't sign Pete and they don't sign Anthony Santander, their lineup is missing power. Yes, you can bring in Jesse Winker, and he brings a little bit of pop. Jurickson Profar hit 24 homers last season. Maybe he has a little bit of pop to his game that he brings into the fold, but it's 20 home run pop, not 40 home run pop. So I did not like seeing that the Mets are nearly out on Santander, that's the less likely of the three. I do like the idea of signing Jurickson Profar, but as the Mets DH. Now, speaking of that, one thing Martino notes, adding a full-time DH could squeeze Starling Marte off the roster, subtracting his potential offensive contributions. So if they signed a Profar and they had signed Pete Alonso, I think you're going to see Marte shipped somewhere else. And I do like the idea of signing Profar even early because it does give you at least a somewhat suitable contingency plan where, let's say you sign Profar and Iglesias and you're still waiting out Pete. Well, now Jerks and Profar could be your first baseman. It could be. He can DH some. You have Marte to DH some. You have those guys to help out in the outfield. You just have a pretty well-rounded roster. Yes, I think you're missing power, but at least you got options, and Iglesias gives you another good one in the infield. Like, that's the way the Mets can go about this thing if they choose to. And the funny thing is, Profar's a Boris client. So if you ended up putting on a full court press to get Profar, I just wonder how that all works out. It's a little bit tricky, but hey. I like seeing the Profar in the mix because he is coming off a good season. I wouldn't want the Mets to sign him to a 3-year deal, but if it's a 1 or a 2-year deal, I would be in on it. Here's a guy that does not strike out a ton. He's always been a good at bat. High walk rates, not bad strikeout rates. So he's always been solid in that regard. He hasn't always tapped into his power, but he did this past season, and I think he's a gamer as well. That game has mostly translated in San Diego the last couple of years. When he hasn't been in San Diego, it hasn't been great, but for a 1 or a 2-year deal, for a DH potentially who can contribute at first, a little bit in the outfield, I would like the signing, especially because he was not tendered the qualifying offer. So no draft picks would have to go out if you did sign him. Now, another report, aside from what Martino talks about the story that I do want to mention on this section, the Mets adding an outfield bat. There has been multiple reporters that have linked the Mets to Alex Verdugo today, and I hate that. Hate it. Wasn't good for the Yankees, not a good hitter, defensive first outfielder. The only way that it makes sense if you're going to start Volpe, geez, got my Yankees mixed up. Verdugo in right field against right-handed pitching and start Marte at DH or in the outfield against left-handed pitching. And the days that Verdugo is playing right, Juan Soto's DHing. Then at least your outfield defense is ridiculously good with Verdugo and right, Nimmo and left, and either Tyrone Taylor or Jose Siri in center. But then you're carrying 2 below-average bats in your lineup with whoever's in center and with Verdugo. And if Francisco Alvarez doesn't have a better season, all of a sudden you have a bottom third of your lineup that's pretty bad. Jeff McNeil, he also might have a bad season. So I don't love that as an option. I hope that those reports aren't true or the Mets were just checking in and ultimately another team signs Verdugo. The third section that Andy Martino notes as far as Pete Alonso alternatives is trading for a first baseman, but he all but says that Yandy Diaz and Brandon Lau are staying put with the Rays. He mentions Luis Ariz. Here's the thing about Luis Ariz. He does not bring power to the table. And if you thought Pete Alonso was a bad first baseman, wait till you watch Luis Ariz. I like Ariz as a DH if you cleared Marte and you had signed Alonso or Bregman to fix your infield. And Ariz is just a slap hitter as your DH, but a guy that's going to hit 320 and winning a batting title and be hitting, have him batting in front of Juan Soto, whether it's Lindor, Ariz, Soto, however you want to line it up. I think that would be an interesting concept because Ariz is not going to cost too much on the trade market. At the same time, he's an imperfect player, and the Mets can do better, in my opinion. Better would be Tristan Casas, but we don't know if he's actually going to be moved. Martino notes him in this piece, and I think the only way that happens is if Alex Bregman signs with the Red Sox, they decide to move Devers to first, and then they try to flip Casas for pitching. But if they trade Casas and Masataka Yoshida is not attached to it, which is an option we have talked about on the show already this offseason, he's going to cost a lot. Like, they might ask for Brandon Sproat a lot. So I don't think that's really viable. And then the final option is to sign Bregman. But Martino says this is the least likely alternative. He actually even says it's virtually impossible to imagine Bregman as a Met unless he accepts a short-term pillow contract. And if he's ready to accept one of those contracts, Pete Alonso probably is as well, and he just ends up back on the Mets. So bottom line, I think we're still mostly where we have been, but it is interesting that Martino reported all this information today because it is sort of setting the stage of, hey, the negotiations aren't going anywhere. And it's the Mets sort of putting out of the public, we're not moving. Like Scott Boras trying to wait them out. It's not happening. So maybe this helps get the two sides to the table. Otherwise, it could be a longer winter for the polar bear, who might not sign until deep into spring training. You never know. That's the dangerous game that the Mets, or not, excuse me, not the Mets, that Scott Boras is playing right now with Boras and with Bregman. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. If we don't get any news tomorrow, we will get back to the show. I promised you on yesterday's show where I talked about today doing a podcast on Mark Vientos and Francisco Alvarez. Which one has the brighter future? We will touch on that tomorrow if nothing else pops up in the market. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's show. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day. Now, for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming channel covering everything in the world of sports. We're talking about Locked On Sports Today with our local hosts from each team, league-wide hosts from each league. Find Locked On Sports Today streaming 24/7 on YouTube.